Okay, the last thing we need to talk about here with oil is something called peak oil. And this might be the biggest discussion in the United States and in the world in the next few decades. So let's talk a little bit about it so you're knowledgeable on this topic. Worldwide production of oil has peaked somewhere around 2005 to 2009 and is now declining worldwide. So if you look here on this graph, right about here, and we'll scroll right down here, somewhere between 2005 and 2010, the production of oil and gas in the world has peaked. All right, that means we're pulling out less oil and gas from the ground today than we were a few years ago. It is now in decline. And that trend, according to scientists, will continue to fall. So what that means is we will have less oil and less gas in the future. So in economics, as supply becomes tight but demand remains high, prices have nowhere to go but up. All right, so we don't have anything that we would call cheap oil anymore. We've hit our peak. Unless we discover some vast new oil supply somewhere, we will decline tremendously over the next 50 years with nothing right now to replace it. So the concept of peak oil means that we need to start thinking about alternatives or we will have no choice. All right, some people claim this to be a myth and that there's still a lot of oil left on Earth. All right, this chart greatly exaggerates this, but I put it here to make a point. We take a look at this pyramid, and what we have up here at the top in 22 billion barrels of proved reserves. All right, so what that means is this is what we know. This is what's been proven to be underground. All right, now the next piece of pyramid here, 400 billion barrels that are technically recoverable. If you remember, when we pull oil out of the ground, we only get about 50% of it. So the other 50% is technically recoverable. We can go in there and still recover some of that. But what happens is that's very costly. The technology isn't great yet. We use carbon dioxide as a dissolvable material to help pull some of it out, but it becomes a little bit more expensive to get that technically recoverable crude oil. And then you see here 800 billion barrels of oil shale is still out there. All right, what that means is we still have a lot of oil in the ground, but it's in the form of oil shale. All right, oil shale, it's very environmental destructive to extract oil from oil shale. So of that technically recoverable oil that we still may or may not have out there, it's still expensive or it's still environmentally destructive. Therefore, I really don't see the price of oil going anywhere but up in the future. All right, so we're looking at huge economic considerations as well as huge environmental considerations as we move through peak oil to a decline in production. All right, this quote here is a good one, and I put this in here for a reason. One thing is clear: the era of easy oil is over. What we all do next will determine how well we meet the energy needs of the entire world in this century and beyond. It's a good quote, but we have to consider who it's coming from. It's coming from David O'Reilly, the chairman and CEO of the Chevron Corporation, all right, a gigantic oil company. The era of easy oil is over. All right, our society depends on oil, so without it, we'll be in trouble. So keep that in mind as we move forward. All right, let's look at the top oil producers in the world. And this graph shows a lot, but I'm going to talk very quickly about the oil producers. All right, where is the oil? Who has the oil in the world? All right, so if you look at these major producers here, you have Saudi Arabia, Russia. All right, the United States is 3, Iran, Mexico, China, and Canada follow out the top 7. All right, but if you take a closer look at this, all right, let's think about the economic and the social components to the oil producing countries. So here you have Saudi Arabia, which has and produces the most oil in the world. All right, now Russia, we don't really talk to. Iran, we don't really talk to. So what that does is it makes Saudi Arabia our best friends. The United States being the top oil consuming country in the world. All right. If you look over here, here's the consumers. All right, United States is number 1. We consume a lot more even than the number 2 country in the world, China. All right, we are the top consumer in the world, so that makes Saudi Arabia our best friend. So you'll notice that most of the policies or most of our concern is making sure that Saudi Arabia is all right. All right, we need to keep our interests protective so we can get our oil. We have since gotten a lot of oil from our neighbors. All right, this chart is a little bit old, and Canada has become one of our better friends in the oil business. All right, they're close. It has a lot of oil. They've economically been able to extract more and more oil out of the tar sands of Canada and Alberta, and we'll talk about them. But they have now jumped into being one of our major importers of oil. Okay, so this leads us to OPEC. You need to understand who OPEC is. The Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. These are the countries that have the largest reserves, and they basically set the prices of oil. Their power has been declining, but they're still very powerful because they set the price for oil, which impacts the price for gas for us in our cars. All right, so when you talk about the cost of gas at the pump, our politicians have very little pull and can do very little about the price of gas. It's all about OPEC and what they do. So you have to remember that oil is not a United States market, it's a worldwide market. All right, oil produced in the United States doesn't really stay here. It can go anywhere. In fact, most of what we produce is exported, and we import oil. All right, so who do we import it from? Let's take a look at the oil imported into the United States. All right, number 1 is Canada. All right, and then if you look here, number 2 is Mexico, our two neighbors. All right, it might surprise you, but if you ask people where we get our oil from, most people will say Saudi Arabia. And that's somewhat correct, but especially recently, it's our neighbors that we get most of our oil. All right, most people think we get our oil from the Middle East, and that's true. In the case of Saudi Arabia, we get a great deal of oil from the Middle East, but if you take a look here, you have Africa, South America, Middle East, South America, South America, South America, Middle East. All right, so it isn't only the Middle East. In fact, we get most of our oil from our neighbors, a lot from South America, and then yes, we do have interest in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia. It might surprise you to learn that it's our neighbors where we get most of our oil from. But it should make sense because they are our neighbors, and they're close, and they have it. All right, so let's take a quick look at the oil production in the United States and where that comes from. Sticking with the concept of peak oil, our peak, and I'm talking about peak production in millions of barrels per day. All right, the peak production actually occurred somewhere in the early 1970s. All right, so even though the world has peaked recently, it's been some time since the United States oil production has peaked. And we actually went up a little bit somewhere in the 1980s, but we've been declining ever since. And if you notice, we're actually on a rise again currently because we found some new deposits, namely North Dakota. All right, and we're talking about drilling more in Alaska, but because of those newly discovered deposits or newly accessible deposits, we are at a little bit of an uptick. But sticking with peak oil, you should know we peaked somewhere around the 1970s, and we've been declining ever since. All right, here are some of those deposits, and I want to use this map very quickly to just help you understand why oil prices have been historically low recently. All right, and it all comes down to OPEC and the new companies in the U.S. All right, so I'll give this a shot, and hopefully you can follow along. We have most of our oil comes out of Alaska, okay, in the northern part of Alaska, and we have oil pipelines to take it down to Valdez, and then it goes out to the refineries and into production. A lot of our oil gets drilled in the Gulf of Mexico, and that's where the BP disaster occurred. Some of it out in the Midwest. Okay, so another one is in the agricultural belt. But right up here are some new businesses when it comes to oil companies. All right, these are our new oil businesses. Now, the oil companies and the coal companies and the fossil fuels are heavily subsidized by the government. However, these new oil businesses are just like any new business. They're struggling to stay afloat. So now OPEC is so powerful. All right, they typically set the prices for oil, and because these new oil businesses are very new, they need to make as much profit as possible. So they need, in order for them to make a profit, they need oil to be selling somewhere between $80 and $100 a barrel. All right, and that's for them to make a profit and to stay in business. What OPEC has done is they've allowed the supply of oil to remain high. Okay, if they scale back production, the price of oil would go up. All right, but what they've done is they've allowed oil production to remain high. All right, so supply has remained high. All right, which has driven the cost down. They've allowed that to happen. So where the cost of oil is, it might be down to $60 a barrel. All right, these oil companies can't handle it. All right, they need higher prices. OPEC will survive. So what OPEC is trying to do is put these new oil companies out of business, and they're going to outlast the temporary low cost of oil. All right, so if you think about who wins, it's going to be OPEC, who is going to hurt the new oil companies and the new businesses in the United States. But it's also us, you and me. We're paying less at the pump. It's a little bit cheaper for home heating oil. So it's been the consumer that has been reaping the benefits of a temporary low price of oil. All right, so it'll be interesting to see what happens with these new oil companies if they're able to outlast the temporary low cost of oil. But don't worry, the price of oil will go back up, and we'll be talking about remember when oil was cheap. I hope this lecture taught you a little bit about the basics of oil and some of the issues that we'll be talking about more detailed in class, including the Keystone XL pipeline, the tar sands of Canada, the BP oil spill, and so forth. So hopefully this got you primed and ready to go and discuss further in detail some of these concepts about oil and this very valuable natural resource. Thanks.